The Minotaur's Labyrinth explained. A prison built to keep a plague in. We are told the story of the Labyrinth, a maddening, subterranean maze built beneath the grand palace of Crete to house a terrible beast. The Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, with an insatiable, unnatural hunger for human flesh. It is a tale of divine punishment, a monstrous birth, and a glorious heroic conquest. But what if this story, like the labyrinth itself, is merely an outer wall, an elaborate and frightening facade designed to conceal a darker, more terrifying, and more clinical truth at its center? What if the Minotaur was not a monster, but a victim, and the labyrinth not a cage for a beast, but a quarantine for a disease? Today, we descend into the twisting, cold stone corridors of that dark place, not to find a monster, but to uncover a tragedy of epidemiology. This is a story of a royal family's desperate, secret attempt to contain a horrifying, God-born contagion. A story of a prince who became the first and only vessel for a disease that threatened to unravel the very fabric of human civilization. And the story of a so-called hero who, in his quest for glory, broke the seal, killed the patient, and risked unleashing a pestilence of the mind upon the entire world. Welcome to Mythos Unveiled. Today we seek to explain the labyrinth, not as the lair of a monster, but as the tomb of a prince and the prison of a plague. Our story begins not with a monster, but with an act of pride, the fertile soil from which so many great Greek tragedies grow. Minos, the mighty and ambitious king of Crete, stood on the precipice of absolute power. To solidify his claim to the throne against his doubting brothers, he prayed to the formidable god of the sea, Poseidon, to send him a sign of divine favor, a clear mark of his right to rule. In a public display of piety, he vowed that whatever magnificent creature emerged from the waves, he would sacrifice it immediately in the god's honor. Poseidon heard his prayer, and from the churning, white-capped Aegean Sea, a creature of breathtaking, otherworldly beauty emerged. It was a bull, but a bull like no other. Its hide was as pure and white as freshly fallen snow on a distant mountaintop. Its great horns gleamed like polished mother-of-pearl, and its eyes held the deep, ancient, and unnerving intelligence of the ocean itself. It was a clear and undeniable mark of divine approval, a living testament to Minos's chosen status. But when Minos looked upon this magnificent creature, he was overcome not with piety, but with a terrible human greed. Such a perfect, flawless animal, he thought, was too beautiful to be sacrificed to the flames. It would be a far greater testament to his own glory, to his own power, to add this divine bull to his royal herds. Believing he could fool a god, Minos hid the white bull away and sacrificed a lesser, common bull from his own stock in its place. He had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. One does not break a vow with the Earthshaker and expect to go unpunished. Poseidon, enraged by this mortal arrogance, devised a punishment that was not swift and clean, like a lightning bolt from Zeus. No, his revenge would be slow, insidious, and designed to attack the very heart of Minos's pride. His family, his lineage, his legacy. The sea god did not strike Minos directly. Instead, he turned his wrath upon the king's wife, the beautiful Queen Pasiphae. He afflicted her with a terrible, divine madness, a curse known as zoophilia. She was consumed by an overwhelming, unnatural, and utterly maddening lust for the very white bull her husband had so foolishly refused to sacrifice. Her divine passion became a sickness of the soul, an obsession that drove her to the very edge of sanity. She could think of nothing else. In her cursed eyes, she saw the bull not as an animal, but as the object of a love so profound, so all-consuming, it was a form of twisted worship. Desperate to consummate this horrifying desire, she turned to the only man in Crete brilliant and immoral enough to help her. The exiled Athenian inventor, Daedalus, a man already haunted by his own dark secrets. Daedalus, a genius whose mind was untethered by conscience or conventional morality, listened to the queen's desperate, shameful plea, and he did not refuse. He constructed his most infamous and unsettling creation, a hollow wooden cow, crafted with such exquisite, lifelike detail that it was indistinguishable from the real thing. He covered it in a genuine cowhide, scented it, and wheeled it into the pasture where the divine white bull grazed. Queen Pasiphae concealed herself inside the wooden effigy, and the great white bull, an instrument of divine vengeance, was fooled by the master craftsman's artifice. From this profane and divinely cursed union, a child was conceived, a child that would carry the weight of its grandfather's pride, its mother's madness, and a god's terrible biological revenge. When Queen Pasiphae gave birth, the midwives screamed in terror. The child that emerged was not fully human. He had the perfect, strong body of a newborn prince, but his head was that of a bull calf. His eyes held not the innocent, unfocused gaze of an infant, but a confused, primal, and unsettling spark. In a moment of tragic hope, they named him Asterion, the Starry One, a beautiful name for a child born of such profound darkness. King Minos was horrified beyond measure. This was his son, his heir, yet he was also a living, breathing monument to his sin and his wife's public shame. He could not kill the child. It was his own blood, and more importantly, the result of a divine curse. To harm him would be to invite even greater and more direct wrath from the gods. But he could not allow the world, or even his own court, to see him. At first, they kept him hidden in the deepest, most isolated chambers of the grand palace of Knossos. For a time, he was just a child, albeit a strange and disquieting one. He was nursed and cared for in secret by a trusted few. But as he grew, something terrible began to manifest. It was not just his physical form that was monstrous. Something was wrong with his very essence. The lost Cretan chronicles, a set of clay tablets discovered in a sealed chamber beneath the ruins of Knossos, described the prince's early years in chilling detail. The child did not cry for milk, but for meat, raw and bleeding. His skin was feverishly hot to the touch, a constant low-grade fire, and those who cared for him for too long they grew sick. A deep, gnawing sickness of the mind, an irritability that blossomed into unreasoning rage and profound confusion. This was the true, insidious nature of Poseidon's curse. It was not just a monstrous birth. It was a contagion. Prince Asterion was not a monster in the classical sense. He was patient zero. He was the living, breathing vessel for a divine plague, a sickness that attacked not just the body, but the mind, the very soul. It stripped away reason, empathy, and higher thought, leaving only primal, bovine rage and a terrible, gnawing hunger. The craving for flesh was not a simple, monstrous appetite. It was a symptom of the disease, a manifestation of its aggressive, consuming nature. The servants and guards assigned to the prince's hidden chambers began to change. They became paranoid, aggressive, their tempers flaring at the slightest provocation. Fights would break out over nothing. Men who had been loyal, disciplined soldiers were found in corners, ramming their heads against the stone walls, bellowing with a rage that was not their own. The plague was insidious. Perhaps it was airborne, or perhaps it was psychic, a madness that spread through proximity, through prolonged exposure to the cursed prince. King Minos, in a growing panic, consulted his most trusted oracles. They returned, their faces pale with terror, with a horrifying prophecy. The bull of Minos carries a plague of the soul. If he is ever allowed to walk free among men, If his breath is allowed to mingle with the crowds, the great cities of the world will become madhouses, and all of humanity will be reduced to bellowing, bloodthirsty, and self-destructive beasts. He must be contained, or the world of men will end. The king was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had a son he could not kill, who was also a biological weapon of mass destruction that could end civilization. He needed a prison unlike any other. A prison that could hold not just a body, but a disease. A perfect quarantine zone so flawlessly designed that nothing could get in, and more importantly, that the sickness could ever get out. Once again, in desperation, he turned to the man whose genius had helped start it all. He summoned Daedalus. Daedalus was given a task that would have broken any other mind, a challenge that required not just architectural genius, but a deep understanding of psychology, magic, and disease. "Build me a prison for my son," King Minos commanded, his voice heavy with the despair of a failed king and a heartbroken father. "Build me a place from which there is no escape, a place that can hold a prince, a monster, and a plague." Daedalus, forever bound to the king by his own past crimes, understood the true, terrifying gravity of the situation. He had seen the madness spreading among the palace guards with his own eyes. He knew this was not just about hiding a royal shame. This was about saving the world. And so he set about designing his magnum opus, his greatest and most terrible creation, the Labyrinth. It was not designed simply to confuse, as a common maze would be. Every aspect of its construction was a complex principle of biological and psychic containment, an architectural form of medicine and quarantine on a grand, divine scale. First, the location. It was built beneath the grand palace of Knossos, deep within the earth. The cool, subterranean stone was chosen to soothe the constant, feverish heat that emanated from Asterian's afflicted body, to keep his rages as placid and manageable as possible. Next, the revolutionary design. The winding, endless, and utterly illogical corridors were not just a maze to prevent escape. They were a psychological dampener. The constant confusion, the lack of straight lines, the disorienting turns, the dead ends that led back to the same passages, all of it was designed to keep the mind of the prisoner perpetually occupied, to prevent his rage and the plague's energy from focusing, from building to a critical point where it might breach the containment of the walls themselves. It was a mental cage as much as a physical one, designed to keep its inhabitant in a state of constant, low-level confusion. The walls themselves were not simple stone. Daedalus, using his secret knowledge of ancient arts, infused the mortar with lead and other deadening metals, creating a kind of divine-era Faraday cage. The walls were designed to block the psychic emanations of the plague, to prevent the madness from seeping through the rock and infecting the city of Knossos above. There were no windows, no sources of natural light. Light, Daedalus theorized, agitated the prince's condition, sharpening his senses and his rage. The eternal, oppressive darkness was a form of sedative. The only light came from flickering torches, placed in high, inaccessible niches, providing just enough light for deliveries but not enough to provide comfort or a sense of direction. And at its very center, there was not a cell or a dungeon. There was a chamber, a semblance of a royal room, with a stone trough for fresh water, piped in from a secret spring, and a grim stone chute through which food could be delivered without any direct contact. It was the heart of the quarantine, the most isolated and secure point in all of creation. The construction of the labyrinth took years. It was a silent, sorrowful monument, built by a genius who was trying to atone for his part in creating the very horror he was now trying to imprison. When it was finished, the young prince, Asterian, now grown into a creature of immense strength and tragic confusion, was led into its dark, twisting passages for the last time. The great bronze doors, also designed by Daedalus with a lock that had no key, were sealed shut. The labyrinth was complete, not as a lair for a monster, but as a sterile, inescapable, and permanent containment facility for a world-ending plague. The boy who was once a prince was now a permanent patient, and his father, the king, had become the grim warden of a secret that would haunt him for the rest of his days. For years, the secret held. The labyrinth did its work. The plague was contained. The world outside remained safe, blissfully unaware of the epidemiological time bomb ticking beneath the floors of the Palace of Knossos. But the containment had a terrible, recurring cost. The divine plague within Asterion was a living thing, an entity with a hunger, and it needed to be fed. Not just with the food that was sent down the chute, but with life force, with psychic energy. The labyrinth's dampening effect was not perfect. If left entirely alone, the plague's power would build and build, like pressure in a sealed vessel, until it overwhelmed the psychic dampeners of the labyrinth, and the madness would begin to leak out into the world. The only way to vent this pressure, to keep the contagion stable, was through periodic, controlled sacrifice. This is the dark, clinical truth behind the infamous Athenian tribute. The story we are told is that King Minos, after his human son Androgeus was killed in Athens during the Panathenaic Games, demanded a blood price in his rage. Every 9 years, the city of Athens must send 7 of its finest youths and 7 of its most beautiful maidens to be devoured by the Minotaur. It is presented as an act of cruel, tyrannical revenge. But the reality, as unveiled by our understanding of the labyrinth as a quarantine facility, is far more chilling. It was not revenge. It was medicine. The 14 Athenian youths were not just food. They were psychic sponges. They were chosen for their youth, their vitality, their strong, vibrant life force. When they were sent into the labyrinth, their terror, their despair, their confusion, and ultimately their potent life energy were absorbed by the plague through its host, Asterion. This terrible feeding would placate the contagion, satisfying its hunger and reducing its psychic pressure to a safe level for another 9 years. It was a horrifying, but from Minos's perspective, necessary geopolitical medical procedure. Minos was not a tyrant enjoying his vengeance. He was a desperate king performing a terrible, recurring act of triage. He sacrificed 14 innocent lives from a rival city to save the millions in his own kingdom, and indeed the entire world. Imagine the grim scene. The Athenian youths, known as the Thesii, arriving on a ship with black sails, a symbol of their impending doom. They are not led to a monster's feeding trough in a public spectacle. They are led in silence to the great, silent bronze doors of the labyrinth. The doors are open just enough for them to be pushed inside, and then sealed again, leaving them in utter darkness. They are not hunted in a traditional sense. They are simply lost. They wander the dark, cold, silent corridors, their hopes slowly draining away, their minds unraveling. The air itself is thick with the psychic residue of the plague, a low-level hum of madness that slowly but surely erodes their sanity. They hear the distant, sorrowful, and terrifying bellows of the prince in the center, and they go mad with fear. Some die of terror, some of starvation, others, their minds broken by the plague's influence, turn on each other in the suffocating darkness. And Asterion, the Minotaur, in his central chamber, is drawn to the fresh, vibrant life force that has entered his prison. He finds them, not as a predator hunting prey, but as a diseased body seeking a cure, a fever seeking to be cooled. The act of him consuming them is the final, grim part of the ritual, the moment the psychic pressure valve is fully released. This terrible cycle continued for years. It was a price the world paid without ever knowing what it was paying for. It was a secret kept in blood and stone, a recurring tragedy that maintained a fragile, horrifying, and necessary balance. This fragile, terrible balance was destined to be broken. A new golden thread was being woven on the loom of the fates. A hero destined to change the world, whether for good or for ill. His name was Theseus, the brave and ambitious son of the king of Athens. When the time came for the third tribute, Theseus, full of youthful pride and a righteous anger that bordered on arrogance, volunteered to be one of the 7 youths. He vowed to his father and to the grieving people of Athens that he would enter the Labyrinth, slay the Minotaur, and end the tyranny of Crete forever. He was seen as a savior, a noble hero willing to sacrifice himself for the good of his people. He was, in truth, an ignorant and dangerously overconfident fool. He saw a simple story of a monster and a tyrant. He did not, and could not, understand the complex, terrifying, epidemiological reality of the situation. He was a doctor who saw a fever and decided the best cure was to kill the patient, without ever considering the nature of the disease itself. When he arrived in Crete, his heroic bearing and divine parentage, some say he too was a son of Poseidon, captured the heart of King Minos's own daughter, the Princess Ariadne. She was a priestess of the palace, and unlike others, she knew something of the true nature of her half-brother's tragic condition. She pitied the tormented creature in the dark, but she also fell deeply and passionately in love with the handsome, confident Athenian hero. Torn between her duty to her kingdom's terrible secret and her love for Theseus, she made a fateful choice. She decided to help him survive. She went to the one man who could outwit the labyrinth, its own creator, the aging and embittered Daedalus. She begged the old inventor for the secret to navigating the maze. Daedalus, perhaps seeing a way to finally strike back at the king who held him prisoner, or perhaps simply swayed by the princess's desperate plea, relented. He gave her the secret. It was not a map. No map could chart the shifting madness of the labyrinth's design. It was something far simpler and far more brilliant. A ball of linen thread. Have him tie one end to the entrance, Daedalus instructed, and unspool it as he goes. It is the only way he will find his way back. The labyrinth can trick the mind, but it cannot trick a simple, unbroken, physical line. Ariadne gave the ball of thread and a sharp sword to Theseus on the night before the tribute. She made him promise that if he survived, he would take her with him, away from Crete and her cursed family forever. Theseus, his mind set on glory and the slaying of a monster, readily agreed. The next day, he and the other Athenian youths were led to the great bronze doors. As he was pushed inside, he tied the end of Ariadne's thread to the lintel. And then, sword in hand, a beacon of ignorant heroism, he plunged into the darkness, unspooling the line behind him, a trail of hope in a place that was designed to have none. Theseus ventured deeper into the labyrinth than any tribute had before. The silence was absolute, the darkness profound and disorienting. The air was cold and stale, thick with the scent of old stone and something else, a faint, coppery smell of old blood, and a low, persistent, psychic hum that made the hairs on his arms stand up and his teeth ache. He did not wander aimlessly. He was a hunter. He followed the distant, mournful sounds that echoed through the twisting corridors, the sorrowful bellows of the Minotaur. He was not just exploring a maze. He was walking purposefully into the heart of a cosmic containment zone, toward the epicenter of a divine plague. He found the Prince, Asterion, in the central chamber. The creature that stood before him was not the raging, aggressive, bloodthirsty beast of legend. It was a pathetic, tragic figure. It was huge and immensely powerful, yes, but its bullish eyes were filled not with malice, but with a deep, unending, and profound confusion and pain. It was a sick, lonely creature, trapped in a body and a mind that were not its own, a prisoner in its own flesh. The sight should have given any true hero pause. It should have raised questions. But Theseus saw only the monster of the stories. He saw his target. He saw his path to glory. The battle, if it could be called that, was not a glorious one. Asterion was strong, but he was not a trained warrior. He fought with the clumsy, desperate rage of a cornered, sick animal. Theseus, a skilled fighter trained in the arts of war, armed with a sharp sword and a clear, uninfected mind, was more than his match. He dodged the creature's clumsy, lumbering charges, his blade flashing in the dim, distant torchlight. The fight was brutal and tragically short. Theseus, the great hero of Athens, plunged his sword deep into the heart of the Minotaur. In his final moments, as the life faded from him, the bullish, monstrous features of Asterion seemed to soften. The rage and confusion in his eyes cleared for a single lucid instant, replaced by a flicker of something eerily human, something that looked almost like gratitude. He was finally being released from a life of unending torment. The prince was dead, but the plague was not. The moment its living host died, the divine contagion, the psychic virus, was released from its biological prison. It was no longer contained within a living, breathing body. It was now a free-floating, aerosolized entity in the very air and stone of the labyrinth. The psychic hum that Theseus had felt before now rose to a deafening, mind-shattering scream in his head. The oracle at Delphi, in a later, suppressed prophecy, was said to have proclaimed, "The hero has slain the patient, but the sickness now infects the very stones of his prison. He has not killed the monster. He has given it the freedom of the maze." Theseus, clutching his head, his mind reeling from the psychic assault, stumbled back. He felt a rage that was not his own bubble up inside him. He felt a primal confusion clouding his thoughts, a desire to bellow and charge at the shadows. He had to get out, now. He turned and frantically followed the simple, life-saving thread of Ariadne, his only guide in the maddening darkness. He burst out of the bronze doors, into the bright Cretan sunlight, gasping for air. His mind a whirlwind of terror, pain, and misplaced triumph. He had done it. He had slain the Minotaur. He gathered Ariadne and the surviving, traumatized Athenian tributes, and they fled to their ship, setting sail before King Minos even knew that his secret and his son were gone. He was a hero. He had freed Athens from its terrible burden. He had no idea what he had truly done. Theseus sailed away from Crete a celebrated, if mentally scarred, hero. His infamous abandonment of the Princess Ariadne on the island of Naxos is often seen as his one great character flaw in this tale, an act of callous betrayal. But perhaps it was something more. Perhaps, as he sailed farther from Crete, the influence of the labyrinth's psychic plague, a seed of which had been planted in his mind, began to take hold. His decision to leave her was not one of simple callousness, but of a creeping, irrational paranoia, a nascent madness he could not understand. He had been infected, and his mind was beginning to fray at the edges. His tragic return to Athens, where he famously forgot to change his ship's black sails to white, leading his father, King Aegeus, to believe him dead and throw himself into the sea in grief, can also be seen through this new, terrifying lens. Was it simple forgetfulness in his moment of triumph? Or was it the action of a mind no longer fully in control, a mind subtly twisted by the thing he had encountered in the dark? And what of the labyrinth itself? It was now empty of its living prisoner, but it was not empty of the plague. The contagion, now unbound from a single host, seeped into the very stones, turning the entire, vast, subterranean structure into a massive, dormant petri dish of divine madness. The psychic pressure, no longer vented by the periodic Athenian sacrifices, began to build and build and build, waiting, The stories say that Daedalus and his son Icarus were later imprisoned in the labyrinth by a vengeful King Minos. They escaped using wings of wax and feathers. But what if their imprisonment served another purpose? What if King Minos, realizing the terrible danger of the now uncontained plague, sent the great inventor back in, hoping he could devise a new way to cleanse or reseal the structure? And what if their desperate flight was not an escape from the king, but an escape from the maddening, mind-altering influence of the plague-infested stones themselves? Over the centuries, the grand palace of Knossos crumbled. The labyrinth was buried beneath the earth, lost to time. But the sickness, the divine contagion, did not die. It merely slumbered, its influence slowly, imperceptibly seeping into the soil of the world. The final testament of the Sibyl, a chilling and obscure text, offers a final, dark thought. The maze was buried, but not destroyed. Its influence seeps into the soil of the world, a slow, invisible poison. The rage of the bull, the madness of the maze, can be seen in the hearts of men. In every senseless war, in every act of mob violence, in every leader who builds walls of confusion and fear to trap his people, the labyrinth lives on. It is dormant, its contagion waiting for a new host, a new city, a new world to fully infect. The story of the Minotaur, then, becomes a terrible warning. It teaches us that some monsters are not meant to be slain. Some prisons are not meant to be opened. And some heroes, in their blind and arrogant quest for glory, can unleash a horror far greater than any beast they could ever hope to kill. They can unleash a sickness of the soul, a plague of madness that, once freed, can never truly be contained again. So we must re-examine the myth of the Minotaur with new, more fearful eyes. It is not a simple tale of a hero slaying a beast in a maze. It is a complex and devastating tragedy about a family's desperate, horrifying, and ultimately failed attempt to contain a world-ending threat. The Minotaur, Prince Asterion, was not a monster to be feared, but a tragic victim to be pitied, first and most lonely casualty of a divine plague. The labyrinth was not a monument to a king's cruelty, but a desperate, brilliant act of architectural quarantine, a subterranean tomb built to safeguard the sanity of mankind. And the Athenian tribute was not an act of tyrannical vengeance, but a grim, recurring medical procedure, sacrificing a few to save the many. And Theseus, the great hero of Athens? He was the fool, an arrogant, well-intentioned, and catastrophically ignorant man who stumbled into a cosmic quarantine zone and, mistaking the patient for the disease, killed the host and set the virus free to fester in the ruins. His great victory was, in truth, a great failure, a moment of celebrated glory that may have doomed the world to a slow, creeping, and eternal madness. The true monster in this story is not the creature with the head of a bull. It is the unseen, the misunderstood, the contagion of rage and primal fear. And the true tragedy is that the hero who was meant to save us may have, in fact, been the one who damned us all. Sometimes, the greatest act of heroism is not to slay the dragon, but to leave the door to its cage firmly and eternally locked. Thank you for descending into the maze with us. If this unveiling of a classic myth has changed your perspective, show your support by liking this video, subscribing to Mythos Unveiled, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the shadows of our most misunderstood legends. What do you believe? Was Theseus a hero or a fool? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember that not all prisons are built to punish, and not all monsters are what they seem.